Are you absolutely sure the gardening season kicks off in the spring? What if I told you that the real battle for a big harvest happens when the temperature is hovering around freezing and the ground is already rock solid with ice? A lot of gardeners panic at the thought of winter sowing, convinced the seeds will just freeze and rot. But others argue the exact opposite, claiming that waiting until spring to plant is a total waste of time and precious moisture. Today, we won't just compare the two methods. We're setting up a definitive crash test for fall versus spring planting. I'll share how I once lost half my vegetable beds because of one stupid mistake, and how the alternative method let me enjoy crunchy carrots straight from the garden as early as June. Are you ready to hear the truth that might completely flip your understanding of the gardening calendar? Let's dive in. Before we get down to the practical tips, let's look at what actually happens to seeds during the cold season. Historically, in the wild, nobody walks around with seed packets in the spring. Plants drop their seeds in the fall. They winterize under the snow, undergo natural selection, and sprout the minute the weather permits. Fall sowing is essentially an attempt to mimic nature, or rather, to align with its natural rhythms, but crucially, under our control. Spring planting, on the other hand, is the classic technique where we try to create ideal, almost greenhouse-like conditions to minimize risk. But does safe always mean better? Let's break this down in detail. Let's start with the biggest advantage of winter sowing: moisture. In the spring, just as we are finally getting around to it, maybe arriving at the garden or the allotment after the spring holidays, the ground is already drying out fast. Those spring winds whisk the moisture away instantly, but seeds that were sown the previous autumn or winter start working the moment the snow begins to melt. They soak up that incredibly beneficial, structured meltwater. They don't need us to water them. While we are stuck in commuter traffic heading out to the garden plot, they are already swelling and getting ready to sprout. This gives the plants a colossal head start, a vital boost we often miss in the spring simply because we couldn't get there fast enough with a watering can. The second factor here is the hardening process itself. Think about two athletes. One trains in a warm, air-conditioned gym, while the other runs long distances outside, regardless of the weather. Which one do you think will be tougher and more resilient? Seeds that have undergone winter stratification or cold treatment produce much more robust seedlings. Weak, diseased, underdeveloped seeds simply don't survive the winter. This is natural selection at work. As a result, in the spring, you end up with a dense stand of the strongest possible plants, the ones that are less susceptible to disease and better able to withstand temperature fluctuations. In contrast, those tender spring seedlings often collapse at the very first sign of a late or unexpected frost. Now let's talk timing. For anyone with a garden, spring is absolute hell. You have to dig the beds, whitewash the fruit trees, prune the shrubs, get the potatoes in, transplant the tomatoes. It makes your head spin. Fall planting takes an enormous amount of stress off your shoulders. Your beds for carrots, beets, greens and onions are already set up and ready to go from the previous fall. You free up those crucial, crazy spring days for truly important projects. This isn't about complicated agronomy, it's about personal time management and sanity. Get the job done in November and you can truly enjoy May. But let's be honest, it's not always smooth sailing. The main risk with winter sowing is those deceptive mild spells, what we call false thaws. If you sow too early, say in October, when temperatures can still jump up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, those seeds are going to sprout. Then a hard frost hits, and that's it. Game over. You won't get a harvest because those tiny seedlings will be instantly wiped out. This is the number one rookie mistake. The rule of thumb here is, better late than early. You should literally be sowing onto frozen ground, only when you are absolutely certain that the sustained cold weather has set in, and there's no going back. Let's talk about the seeding rate. When you sow in the spring, you can carefully space out every single seed, making sure you stretch that expensive planting material. You simply can't do that with winter sowing. We have to factor in the risk that a portion of the seeds will simply perish. This means you need to increase your seeding rate for winter planting by 25 or sometimes even 30%. If you've just bought an expensive hybrid, the kind where the packet only holds 5 seeds, sowing those under the snow is absolute madness. For this method, it's much better to stick to simple, reliable varieties and buy them in larger bulk packets. Let's move on to pest control. Have you ever noticed how flea beetles absolutely devastate early spring plantings of radishes or arugula? They become active right when those tender spring seedlings are just emerging. Full planted crops, however, have already hardened off by that time. Their leaves are much tougher, making them far less appealing to the pests. This lets us get a clean, completely undamaged harvest without using any chemical sprays. We are simply shifting the timing so the plant's vulnerable phase doesn't overlap with the pest's peak activity. But what about the actual garden bed? Prepping the soil is absolutely crucial for successful winter sowing. In the spring, you can just dig the soil over and sow right away. In the fall, however, you need to prepare the bed well in advance, while the soil is still workable. If you wait until the ground is frozen or full of hard clumps, you won't be able to do anything. The bed needs time to settle properly. Furthermore, the location should either be perfectly level or slightly elevated. If you have standing water or a puddle there in the spring, the seeds will suffocate without oxygen and ultimately rot. Low-lying areas are a definite no-go for winter sowing. Let's talk about specific crops now. The queen of overwinter sowing is definitely the carrot. Carrots sown in the spring often suffer badly from the dreaded carrot fly. The overwinter crop, however, manages to completely bypass that vulnerable period. Plus, these carrots usually grow larger and are incredibly juicy. But there's one definite drawback. They just don't store well during the winter months. That's why we eat the fall-sown carrots throughout the summer and use them for all our preservation and canning, while still sowing a second batch in the spring specifically for winter storage. It's the ideal growing conveyor belt. You eat one batch, and the next batch is ready to go. Beets. This vegetable presents a slightly different challenge. Beets are highly susceptible to bolting if they are exposed to severe frost. If you sow a standard variety for overwintering, you risk the plant sending up a seed stalk instead of forming a proper root when spring arrives. And that ultimately means no borscht. For fall or winter sowing, you must specifically seek out varieties marked as bolt resistant or suitable for overwintering. Ignoring this key rule is a guaranteed recipe for failure. Greens, dill, parsley, cilantro, spinach, and lettuces. These are absolute musts. This is where winter sowing really shines, guaranteeing the earliest and most vitamin-packed greens. By the time you are even starting to sow your spring seeds, you will already be harvesting your winter-sown batch for salads. This is especially true for parsley and celery, which are notoriously slow to germinate in the spring because of their high essential oil content. When exposed to the winter elements, those oils wash away or break down, allowing the seeds to sprout quickly and uniformly as soon as the weather warms up. Let's now make the case for spring planting. What is its undeniable advantage? Predictability. In the spring, you are in control of the entire process. You see the weather, you can gauge the condition of the soil. You have the option to use a row cover or plastic sheeting, and you can water with warm water. Spring planting guarantees a more successful outcome, especially in areas with erratic or unstable winters, where the temperature swings wildly from -30 with no snow to 5 degrees with rain. Under those conditions, winter sowing is always a total gamble. Another big plus of spring is the opportunity to truly work the soil. In spring, we can apply nitrogen fertilizers right before planting, allowing us to thoroughly loosen the ground and make it light and airy. Compare this to fall. When we sow directly into frozen ground, we can only cover the seeds with dry soil that we prepared in advance. Proper tilling or deep cultivation is completely out of the question. If the soil on your plot is heavy and clay-based, it can compact so significantly over the winter that it becomes incredibly difficult for fragile sprouts to break the surface and reach the light. Spring makes addressing this issue much, much simpler. The required depth for sowing seeds also varies. Do we sow shallower in winter than in spring? The answer is no, it's the opposite. When sowing for the winter, you actually need to go slightly deeper, about half a centimetre to a full centimetre deeper than you normally would. This extra depth protects the seeds from being washed away by melting snow, and it keeps them safe from hungry birds. However, planting too deeply in the spring can significantly delay germination. It's crucial to understand this distinction and avoid applying your spring planting rules to your autumn or overwintering work. Using the wrong depth is often why gardeners see empty beds come springtime. Mulching. When you sow seeds in late fall or before winter, mulching is absolutely essential. Materials like peat, well-rotted manure, or compost act just like a thermal blanket. They shield the root systems and the seeds themselves from freezing, especially during those harsh, snowless winters. However, the rules change completely in the spring. Mulching immediately after planting isn't always helpful because a lighter coloured mulch can actually reflect sunlight, preventing the soil from warming up adequately. In spring, our goal is to quickly heat the soil, but in winter, the priority is maintaining stable temperatures. Grasping this simple thermal dynamic difference is often the key to saving your entire crop. Onion sets. That's a whole different ball game. Planting your onion sets in the fall or overwintering them is the best strategy for getting a large, beautiful bulb and preventing premature bolting. This works especially well if you choose the smaller, undersized sets, unlike bulbs stored inside where they often dry out. These small sets stay perfectly preserved in the soil throughout the winter months. Come spring, they get a powerful, early head start. Spring planting, on the other hand, runs the risk that the onion won't have enough time to bulk up before the summer heat arrives, forcing it into dormancy while still small. That's a clear win for fall planting. Let's talk flowers and, importantly, aesthetics. Asters, marigolds, cosmos, California poppies, and lavatera. These flowers are excellent candidates for direct sowing in late fall. What's more, when asters are sown this way, they are far less likely to suffer from fusarium wilt, that pesky fungal disease that often wipes out your windowsill seedlings. You end up with sturdy, naturally hardened flower seedlings right in the soil, completely skipping the fuss of pots, grow lights, and indoor babying. This translates to huge savings in windowsill real estate come spring. What should you definitely not direct sow before winter? Warm weather crops, of course. We're talking tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, zucchini, and squash. Sure, sometimes a volunteer tomato or pumpkin might sprout up from the compost heap in the spring, but that is the rare exception. In most temperate climates, 99% of these seeds will simply rot in the cold, damp soil. Also, avoid experimenting with beans and peas unless you are using specific, designated overwintering varieties. These particular crops absolutely need warm ground to thrive. Looking at the financial side, come springtime, seed and fertilizer prices often skyrocket. In the fall, however, garden centres typically run massive clearance sales. Simply put, stocking up and sowing in the autumn might just be cheaper. But keep in mind that you'll need more seed overall. The cost per packet is lower, but the total number of packets required goes up. So, financially, the expenditure ends up being roughly the same. However, the real advantage lies in the quality of the yield and the valuable time saved. It's all about mindset. For many dedicated gardeners, closing down the season is a fundamental ritual. Winter sowing allows us to extend that pleasure of working the earth, even after the major chores are finished. But if you're totally burnt out from the season and just want to forget about the garden until April, don't force it. Spring planting will certainly forgive your lack of enthusiasm in November. Gardening should be a source of joy, not a burden. Choose the method that best suits your temperament. So, what's the verdict? There is no single perfect strategy, but there is definitely a sweet spot. Experienced agronomists advise us not to put all our eggs in one basket. For fall sowing, focus only on the crops you want to harvest as early as possible for immediate consumption. Think bunching carrots, your first greens, and radishes, but leave the main haul, the crops intended for long-term winter storage, for spring planting. Split your risk 50-50. This way, you ensure you get those valuable early vitamins, and you guarantee that you won't be left without winter reserves, even if the weather ultimately lets you down. Let's quickly summarise this planting debate. Winter sowing offers a major advantage in speed and the quality of early produce, but it often sacrifices reliability and the overall storage life of the crop. Spring sowing gives you stability and control, but you often lose precious time and crucial moisture. So, here's my advice. This season, dedicate just one small garden bed to an experiment. Sow a row of carrots and a row of dill right before the first major snowfall. Trust me, when you pull your first crunchy carrot in June, while your neighbours are still weeding their tiny microscopic sprouts, you'll realise just how much this was worth it. Thanks so much for watching all the way through. If you have any experience with winter sowing, please share in the comments below. Tell us what grew well and what didn't. Your shared knowledge could literally save someone else's harvest. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you back in the garden soon.